Okay, so for this lesson, we're skipping all the way to 9.5, solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. So before spring break, we learned how to solve quadratic equations by factoring and completing the square. All right, so now we will learn the third method using the quadratic formula. So why do we use the quadratic formula? We use this when an equation is not easily solved by factoring or completing the square. You know, when we have something like that, let's say it's x squared, and then it's minus x, and then plus 8, right? So if we're trying to solve that, we're trying to factor, it doesn't work, okay? And then with completing the square, we could do it that way, but that would be really messy because we'd end up with a whole bunch of fractions. So instead we have this formula, quadratic formula. And that's all it is. It's a formula, which means we have to figure out what the values are, and we're just going to plug them in and simplify. So here it is, x, and it's not a very pretty formula, but it works. Negative b plus or minus, and then we have a square root with b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. Now, you may recognize the values of a, b, and c. Where do we get those? We get those from the equation, all right? So a is always whatever is in front of x squared, b is what's in front of x, and c is the constant, the one without any variables. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through an example and then we'll do some together. So for step 1, we always want to make sure it's in standard form first, meaning it's got to go, you got to have the x squared first, then the x term, then the constant, and you have to make sure it's equal to 0. So if you have to rearrange anything, that needs to be done in step 1. Okay, step 2, we're going to identify the values of a, b, and c. So again, you can see there, a, b, and c. And then step 3, you're just going to substitute the values of a, b, and c into the formula. And then step 4, this is where all the work is. Step 4 is you got to make sure you're using order of operations, okay? And you're going to simplify. Now, there are 3 possible situations that could happen when solving the using the quadratic formula. So you see how you have a square root here? So sometimes we get a negative number underneath the square root. Sometimes we get 0, and sometimes we get a positive number. So if the part under the square root is positive, you're always going to have 2 answers. That's why there's a plus or a minus in front. If the part under the square root is equal to 0, you'll only ever have 1 answer. And if the part under the square root is negative, you will have no solution, no real solution. Okay? And you'll see when we get to the examples. Okay, so we are going to solve using quadratic formula. I'm going to write it here at the top so we have it. It's negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And it's a formula that you will be using in geometry. You'll be using it in algebra 2 and pre-calculus. So every math class, this is going to come back to us. So it looks a little complicated, but you need to get used to it. Okay, so if we go back, step 1 said make sure this is in standard form first. Is it in standard form? Yeah, it's got the x squared, the x, and the constant all on one side, and it's equal to 0. Step 1's already done for us. Step 2, identify the values of a, b, and c. Okay, so we can see that a is 2, b is 9, and c is negative 18. Step 3, we're going to substitute the values into the formula. So x equals, so negative b, so b is 9, so I'm going to put negative 9. Then we write down this plus or minus sign. And we're going to make a square root. So we want b squared, so that's 9 squared, minus 4ac, so a is 2, c is negative 18, all over 2 times a, so 2 times 2. So I have negative 9 plus or minus. Let's simplify under the radical. So I see 9 squared is going to be 81. And then I have a minus 4 times 2 times a negative 18. So if I have a negative here and a negative here, that's going to turn that into a plus sign. And we're going to multiply 4 times 2 times 18, which is 144. All over 2 times 2 in the denominator is 4. Okay, next what I want to do is I have negative 9 plus or minus, add the 81 and the 144, and that ends up giving us 225 all over 4. Now, I want you to try to simplify this. So you have a calculator. I want you to use your calculator to evaluate. So what are we evaluating? We're evaluating the square root part. So go ahead and type in the square root of 225. We do end up with 15. So negative 9 plus or minus 15 over 4. Now it says if the square root does not simplify to a whole number, then use your calculator to evaluate. Well, we used our calculator to simplify it, but we're not done here. This actually means there's 2 answers. What are the 2 answers? Negative 9 plus 15 over 4 and negative 9 minus 15 over 4. So negative 9 plus 15 gives us 6. 6 over 4 reduces to 3/2, so that's one answer. And negative 9 minus 15 is negative 24. Divided by 4 will give us a negative 6. So our 2 answers are 3/2 and negative 6. Okay, let's try B. So first thing we want to do, I'm going to write it above so we have more room. So A is 3, B is 5, and C is negative 12. And notice this one was already also in standard form. So I'm going to plug it in. So negative B, so negative 5 plus or minus the square root, 5 squared minus 4 times A, which is 3, times negative 12, which is C, all over 2 times 3. So we get negative 5 plus or minus the square root. Now we're going to simplify inside the square root. 5 squared is 25. That's going to be a plus because you have 2 negatives. So 4 times 3 times 12 is 144. All over 2 times 3, which is 6. I have negative 5 plus or minus. Now 25 plus 144 is 169. So use your calculator. Figure out square root of 169 is actually 13. So I have negative 5 plus or minus 13 over 6. So that means I have 2 answers. I have negative 5 plus 13 over 6, and I have negative 5 minus 13 over 6. So negative 5 plus 13 is 8. 8 over 6 reduces to 4/3. That's one answer. Negative 5 minus 13 is negative 18. Negative 18 over 6 is negative 3. Okay, next one. Now, first thing I notice is it's not in standard form. Also, you may notice 10, 5, and 25 are all divisible by 5. So if you ever have something, also if you look at E, you see how I have in E, I have 2x squared equals 12x minus 18. Those are all divisible by 2. If you want, feel free to simplify it before you plug it in, because then you'll have much smaller numbers to work with. So I think that's what I'm going to do. So if I divide everything by 5, I get 2x squared minus x equals 5. Now I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides because I want to make sure it's in the right order. So I have 2x squared minus x minus 5 equals 0. My value of a is 2, b is -1, and c is -5. So I'm going to plug into my formula. Now, it says -b in the formula, right? So -b. If b is negative, we make it positive. So it's like opposite of -1 is +1. We just basically change whatever sign b is. So 1 plus or minus, now, -1 squared, b squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a, which is 2 times 2. So I have 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 plus 4 times 2 times 5, so that's going to be 8 times 5, so 40, all over 4. So I have 1 plus or minus the square root of 41 over 4. Now notice this did not come out to be a perfect square. So the directions are, if it doesn't happen, we're going to use our calculator to evaluate and round answers to the nearest 10th place. So here I have 2 answers. I have 1 plus square root of 41 over 4, and I have 1 minus square root of 41 over 4. You're literally just going to type that into your calculator. So do control divide to make it a fraction. Control divide. And I'm going to just type in 1 plus the square root. You're going to press the control and then 2 down from the control button is the x squared. And if you see in blue, it'll give you a square root. So I'm going to type in that. And then I'm going to divide. So now I'm going to use my arrow to go down to the denominator. Type in 4. And I get 1.85. And I said to round to the 10th place. So if it's 1.85078, it's going to round to 1.9. That's one answer. The other answer is 1 minus the square root of 41. And I want to divide that by 4. And that ends up being -1.35078. So that's -1.4 if I'm rounding to the 10th. If you think you have the hang of it, feel free to stop the screencast and start working on the homework, which is the worksheet. Otherwise, I'll walk you through the rest of these problems. Okay, so this one I have to put in standard form first. So I have 2x squared minus 5x minus 7 equals 0. So I can see that a is 2, b is -5, and c is -7. So I have x equals, so it's -b, so b is -5, so it's going to be the opposite of -5, which is +5, plus or minus, and I have -5 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is -7, all over 2 times 2. So I have 5 plus or minus, I get 25 plus 4 times 2 is 8, times 7 is 56, all over 4. So I have 5 plus or minus, so 25 plus 56 is 81. So I have square root of 81 all over 4. So I have 5 plus or minus, square root of 81 is, that is a perfect square, so it's 9 over 4. So my two answers are 5 plus 9 over 4 and 5 minus 9 over 4. 5 plus 9 will give us 14. 14 divided by 4 is 7 halves, so that's one answer. 5 minus 9 is -4, divided by 4 is -1, so that's my other answer. Okay, previously I had mentioned if you want, you could divide everything by 2. just to make this a little easier. So that'll be x squared equals 6x minus 18. So I want to make this all equal to 0. So I'm going to, let me subtract 6x. I'm going to actually subtract 6x and I'm going to add 18 to both sides. So, and I'm going to put the x squared first. So I have x squared minus 6x plus, oh, and I almost missed it. This should be a 9 because I forgot I have to divide everything by 2. So this should be a minus 9. So that makes it a plus 9. Okay, so A is 1, B is negative 6, and C is 9. So x equals the opposite of negative 6, that's positive 6, plus or minus, and then we have negative 6 squared, b squared, minus 4ac, so minus 4 times 1 times 9, all over 2a, so 2 times 1. So I get 6 plus or minus, I get 36 minus 4 times 1 times 9 is 36, all over 2. So notice what happens, 36 minus 36, I get the square root of 0, but the square root of 0 is just 0. So I have 6 plus or minus 0, so that just really means 6 over 2, which is 3. So this time, whenever we get a 0 under the square root, we just get one answer. That's what I was telling you on this previous page. So when it's equal to 0, you get one answer. If you get a positive number under the square root, you get 2 answers. Let's take a look at f. First thing, let's put it in standard form. So we're going to add 10 to both sides. I get x squared minus 8x plus 10 equals 0. I see A is 1, B is negative 8, and C is 10. So I have x equals negative b, so that's going to make it a positive 8, plus or minus square root. So I have negative 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10, all over 2 times 1. So I have 8 plus or minus the square root. Negative 8 squared is 64, minus 4 times 1 times 10 is 40, all over 2. So I have 8 plus or minus, now 64 minus 40 is going to be 24. Now 24 is not a perfect square, so we're going to figure out what both of these answers are. One answer is going to be 8 plus square root is 24 divided by 2. The other answer is 8 minus square root of 24 over 2. So again, let's do control divide, and we're going to type in 8 plus the square root of 24, and then we're going to divide that by 2. And I get 6.449, so 6.44 will round to just 6.4. And then 8 divided by, 8 minus square root of 24, and then divide by 2. We get 1.55, so rounding to the 10th will be 1.6.